When headlines speak about the India-United States trade deal and its implications for Russian oil, American exports, and even Venezuelan supply options, the story is not just about barrels and contracts. It is about leverage. It is about autonomy. It is about the quiet calculations that shape the behavior of major powers in a world that feels increasingly fragmented. Imagine New Delhi sitting at a crossroads. On one side stands Moscow, offering discounted crude that helped India weather inflation shocks after the Ukraine war. On another side stands Washington, offering trade incentives, tariff relief, and strategic alignment in the Indo-Pacific. Somewhere in the background stands Caracas, a sanctioned but resource-rich state whose oil could become part of a new equation if diplomatic conditions allow. This is not a simple energy swap. It is a geopolitical balancing act. India is the world's third-largest oil importer. Nearly 90% of its crude needs come from abroad. That fact alone defines its foreign policy in ways that are sometimes understated. A country of over 1.4 billion people cannot afford energy disruption. Fuel prices influence inflation. Inflation influences elections. Elections influence stability. Energy, therefore, is not just an economic input in India. It is political oxygen. When Western sanctions hit Russia in 2022, India saw opportunity. Russian crude, particularly the Urals blend, was offered at steep discounts compared to Brent benchmarks. For Indian refiners, this was a financial advantage. Margins improved. Domestic fuel pressures eased. The decision was pragmatic, not ideological. India did not endorse Moscow's war, but it also did not sever ties. It maintained what it calls strategic autonomy. Strategic autonomy is not a slogan in India. It is doctrine. Since independence, Indian foreign policy has sought to avoid entangling alliances. During the Cold War, India led the non-aligned movement. In the 21st century, it practices what many analysts describe as multi-alignment. It works with the United States in the Quad. It buys arms from Russia. It trades heavily with the Gulf. It engages Europe. It avoids dependency on any single power. But the world in 2026 is not the world of 2010. Rivalry between the United States and China has intensified. Sanctions have become a weapon of statecraft. Supply chains are politicized. Energy is no longer neutral. It is strategic. When Washington and New Delhi announced an expanded trade understanding in 2026, observers immediately focused on energy clauses. Reports suggested that India might reduce reliance on Russian crude in favor of increased American exports and potentially Venezuelan shipments if sanction regimes allowed. The signal from Washington was clear. Closer economic partnership comes with expectations of alignment in critical areas. Yet from India's perspective, the question is not whether Russian oil can be replaced. The question is at what cost and with what long-term consequences. Russian crude offered India several advantages beyond price. Logistics were optimized over time. Payment mechanisms evolved to bypass dollar-centric restrictions. Insurance and shipping networks adapted. Indian refiners recalibrated their facilities to process higher volumes of Russian grades efficiently. Replacing that infrastructure is not impossible, but it is not instant. American crude presents a different profile. The United States has become a major exporter of light sweet crude. Transporting oil from the Gulf of Mexico to Indian ports is feasible, and shipments have increased in recent years. But pricing dynamics fluctuate. Freight costs matter. Long-term contracts require stable diplomatic conditions. Then there is Venezuela. Caracas holds some of the largest proven oil reserves in the world, yet its production capacity has suffered from years of sanctions, underinvestment, and infrastructure decay. If the United States eases restrictions and grants specific licenses to Indian refiners, Venezuelan crude could re-enter India's supply mix. But heavy crude from Venezuela requires specialized refining capabilities. Not all Indian refineries are optimized for it. Economic viability depends on discounts and transportation costs. So when geopolitical analysts say India must do its homework, they mean this. Energy substitution is not political theater. It is engineering. It is finance. It is logistics. Beyond economics, there is a larger strategic layer. For the United States, encouraging India to reduce Russian oil imports weakens Moscow's revenue stream. Energy exports fund a significant portion of Russia's federal budget. Every barrel diverted away from Russia is a small dent in that fiscal stability. At the same time, expanding U.S. energy exports strengthens American producers and reinforces the dollar-denominated energy trade system. For Russia, India has been a critical buyer since Western markets shrank. Losing Indian demand would tighten pressure on Moscow's economy. Russia would likely redirect volumes toward China or other Asian buyers, potentially at steeper discounts. That dynamic could reshape pricing structures in Eurasia. India understands these dynamics. It knows that reducing Russian imports entirely could signal alignment with Washington in a way that narrows its diplomatic flexibility. Moscow remains a key defense partner. Russian military equipment forms a significant portion of India's arsenal. Strategic ties go beyond oil, and yet India also sees value in strengthening ties with Washington. The United States is a major technology partner, a key export market, and an essential player in balancing China's rise. Energy cooperation fits into a broader Indo-Pacific strategy. By diversifying oil imports toward the United States, India deepens economic interdependence with a strategic partner. But here's the paradox. India does not want dependence to shift from Moscow to Washington. It wants diversification. It wants optionality. In 2026, the global oil market is volatile. OPEC plus production decisions influence prices. Middle Eastern producers remain dominant suppliers. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and the United Arab Emirates continue to play central roles in India's crude basket. Even if Russian volumes decline, Middle Eastern oil will remain foundational. That reality suggests that the narrative of replacement may be overstated. What India is more likely pursuing is rebalancing. Rebalancing allows India to maintain leverage with all partners. If Russian discounts narrow or sanctions intensify, India can pivot partially. If U.S. political conditions shift, India can recalibrate again. Flexibility becomes strategy. Another dimension is currency. During peak Russian imports, India experimented with non-dollar payment mechanisms. Reducing Russian purchases could increase exposure to dollar transactions. That has implications for foreign exchange reserves and vulnerability to financial pressure. Indian policymakers weigh these risks carefully. Domestic politics also play a role. Energy prices are sensitive. Opposition parties scrutinize foreign policy decisions that might raise fuel costs. Farmers' unions, transport sectors, and small businesses react quickly to price hikes. Any energy pivot must protect domestic stability. China watches this carefully. Beijing is the largest buyer of Russian oil. If India reduces purchases, China could negotiate even better discounts. That would deepen Sino-Russian energy ties and potentially increase Beijing's leverage over Moscow. Washington must consider that consequence. Meanwhile, the Gulf states observe India's diversification efforts. They seek to maintain market share. Some may offer favorable terms to prevent erosion of influence. Energy diplomacy becomes competitive. And Venezuela? Caracas sees opportunity. Sanctions relief tied to political reforms or negotiated settlements could reopen export channels. For India, Venezuelan oil offers diversification, but also reputational risk if U.S. policy shifts again. All of this unfolds against the backdrop of climate commitments. India is expanding renewable energy capacity rapidly. Solar installations grow. Electric mobility expands gradually. Yet hydrocarbons remain essential. Transition takes time. So what is the deeper geopolitical meaning of the India-U.S. trade and energy recalibration? It reflects a shift from transactional neutrality to structured alignment without abandoning autonomy. India is signaling that it is willing to cooperate more closely with the United States on strategic matters, but not at the expense of sovereign choice. For Washington, success would mean India progressively aligning with Western sanction regimes and reducing Moscow's influence. For New Delhi, success means extracting economic benefits while retaining freedom of maneuver. For Moscow, the goal is retaining India as a reliable partner. For Caracas, it is regaining relevance in global oil flows. Energy is the instrument, but power is the theme. In human terms, this is about decision-makers sitting in conference rooms, weighing spreadsheets against strategy. It is about ministers calculating refinery margins while diplomats calculate diplomatic fallout. It is about leaders asking whether short-term discounts outweigh long-term alignment costs. If India moves too quickly away from Russian oil, it risks appearing reactive to American pressure. If it resists too strongly, it risks missing economic incentives in trade cooperation with the United States. The likely path is incremental adjustment. Gradual reduction, not abrupt severance. Expanded U.S. imports where competitive. Selective Venezuelan purchases if sanctions permit. Continued Middle Eastern stability, and a maintained, though perhaps reduced, channel with Moscow. That is how strategic autonomy evolves in 2026. Not through dramatic declarations, but through calibrated shifts. From a geopolitical analyst's perspective, the most important takeaway is this: energy diversification enhances bargaining power. By broadening supply sources, India reduces vulnerability. By engaging multiple suppliers, it strengthens its negotiating position. That flexibility becomes leverage in trade talks, security dialogues, and diplomatic forums. The India-U.S. trade deal, therefore, is not solely about tariffs or crude volumes. It is about embedding India more deeply into Western economic frameworks while preserving multipolar options. In the end, oil flows where incentives align. States act where interests converge. India's homework, as analysts say, involves ensuring that each adjustment strengthens rather than narrows its strategic horizon. Because in a fragmented global order, the real commodity is not oil, it is choice.